All right, everyone. We're live from the Aloft Hotel, downtown Buffalo, New York State Parking Transportation. Stand by.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Krista Tassa from the Municipal Board, and it is my pleasure, as you just heard in the previous presentation, EVs, like it or not, they're coming and they're coming fast. So much so that we have two EV presentations today. The one right this is the first one. The second one will immediately follow our luncheon in the same room. So, now, anyone who saw me at the bar last night knows that if I hear music, I have to dance. So I kid you not, this gentleman told me that his last name is Cha-Cha.
Cha-cha-cha. Thank you, Krista. Audio okay? Okay, it looks like it's on. Yeah, thanks for that opening presentation. It was Justin and Adam, you really teed off EV for the day, so that was great from a historical perspective as well. So I'm Dan Chacha, and I'm from Eco Engineers. We are a sustainability consulting company out of Des Moines. I'm actually located in Hartford, Connecticut, and I'm the EV Services Director. So we work across all different low-carbon fuel types, but my focus is electric vehicles, hydrogen electric vehicles, and renewable electricity. So today I'm going to go through kind of a quick EV kind of primer, and I want to dive into where the market is today. We hear a lot about EVs, but what's the reality of where we are today? I want to provide a little more depth on the incentives. Justin had mentioned the $7.5 billion NEVI program that was signed, I think it was late last year, and others, and then go through a couple case study examples. So the question was asked how many people own an EV, and I think I saw two hands. How many have been in an EV? So that's about half the group. So that's interesting. EVs are, this is kind of a comparison of the advantages of electric vehicles versus ICE vehicles. ICE is internal combustion engine, so gasoline or a diesel engine or anything that you burn to propel. There are numerous advantages here. We have the fact that electricity is powering the drivetrain, powering the wheels, means there's zero tailpipe emissions. It's very quiet. It's just an electric motor. There are very few moving parts on electric vehicles. Some studies have said there are 20 moving parts in an electric vehicle versus 2,000 for an internal combustion engine. You know, you can see different reports that have different numbers there, but the factor is consistently about 100 times the number of moving parts for an internal combustion engine, which leads to lower maintenance for an electric vehicle and more efficiency. And that's really what the advantage of an electric vehicle is, that it converts that electricity, that power source, into movement in a much more efficient ratio than any other kind of internal combustion engine, about 3 times more efficient. Internal combustion engines are about 32 to 35%, maybe 35% on a really efficient gas-powered vehicle, and an electric vehicle is 90–95% efficient. So there's a lot less waste in an electric driven vehicle. The rapid acceleration, no idling, so you aren't wasting fuel just by sitting at a stoplight. You can recover some of that energy with your braking. And the one thing I leave off this list, because it's not something to really quantify, but it's probably the first thing an EV driver says when they talk about their experience with an EV, is that it's fun to drive. It's just a different experience. It's a lot more exhilarating. You have more control. It's kind of like driving a video game car versus the lag that you have in a gas vehicle. It's not perfect, though. There are range limitations with an electric vehicle. Batteries are getting bigger and more dense and providing more distance per charge, but it lags a little bit behind internal combustion engine tanks, usually about 300 to 400 with the extended range batteries in electric vehicles that you can buy today. And I think most internal combustion engines, they target about 500 for a tank of fuel. The charging time is always talked about, how long it takes to charge an electric vehicle. We'll get into the options there briefly in a minute. And then there are higher upfront costs. There's still a gap between internal combustion engine and electric vehicles. That gap is in some ways narrowing, in other ways because of the limited supply with supply chain issues, and it can widen as well. So kind of we're trending towards cost parity over the long, say 3 to 8 years or so horizon, but in the next couple of years, until supply chains really dig in and meet the demand, there's going to be a bit of a gap. So I talked about environmental benefits, and this is a study done by the Union of Concerned Scientists. They compared an average internal combustion engine, an average electric vehicle, to determine the, in this case, greenhouse gas emissions that were experienced through the life of vehicle. For ICE, it was about 7 tons of CO2 to manufacture an internal combustion engine vehicle. A little bit more for an EV because of the battery resources. Takes a little bit more to get those materials at 8. And then they both have about a ton of CO2 to dispose of the vehicle at the end of life. But the orange part there is the real savings. You have 19 metric tons of CO2 over the life of the vehicle versus 49 for an internal combustion engine. So it's about half over the life of the vehicle, considering the manufacturing and disposal of that vehicle as well, for driving an electric vehicle. That's the environmental benefit, and the reason that there's such a push to use this as a device to alleviate climate change. And the other thing is that you're also moving that emissions from the tailpipe, so it's no longer going into cities. You're moving it to the power plants where the power gets generated, and that's easier to kind of capture and sequester or filter and handle. And we also produce electricity generally domestically, whereas our oil and gas is usually imported. But what about the dollars and cents? That's, that's the pocketbook issue that people are really concerned with when they're shopping for vehicles most of the time. So this shows over the life of the vehicle. We've got the purchase price for an EV, a bit more. In this example was, when this one was calculated, about $7,000, $6,000 more than a comparable internal combustion engine for similar class of vehicle. And the savings, though, for electric vehicles over the life of that vehicle, looking at about a 200,000 mile vehicle life, which actually may be on the short end for an electric vehicle. Electric vehicles, because of that maintenance I suggested earlier, may prove to last a lot longer than internal combustion engines. But the gasoline versus electricity use over the life of the vehicle, $40,000 for gasoline, and $12,000 for electricity, and maintenance a little bit lower. So the overall savings about 30%. And that's using, when I worked this out, it was, gas was a little bit more expensive than it is today, but that's, we can see gas prices are much more volatile than electricity in general, so that moves around a bit for the gas. All right, I mentioned this may be, for folks in the parking industry, common knowledge, but I'll just kind of frame out what the different charging methods are here. I won't go into detail on all of this information. It's a little bit of an eye chart here. But you've got really 3 different power levels today that are common for charging an electric vehicle. And then a 4th one that may be the future, or maybe not. So level 1 is plugging into a wall outlet, a regular 110 wall outlet, and charging your vehicle with that. You get about 2 to 5 miles of charge for an electric vehicle per hour. An overnight charge, if you don't drive too much, it can be a perfectly reasonable solution for the majority of your driving. For most people, they want it a little quicker than that. They can move up to a level 2 charger, which is a little bit more expensive. It uses two circuits, so it's like a dryer plug for your electric dryer. It's 30 amps and 240 volts. So it's essentially 4 times the charging capacity and gets you 10 to 20 miles per hour of charge. And then beyond that, if you need something a lot quicker than that, like you're going on a long road trip, there are DC fast charging. This isn't something you typically install in your house. The hardware alone is about $30,000 plus installation. And this is what you'll see on highways and maybe in some downtown areas. So, but this gives you about an 80% of your battery can be charged in 20 to 30 minutes. So if you're doing a long road trip, you get a 400-mile range vehicle, you're going to need a 20-minute, 30-minute break at some point anyway during that road trip. It's really not that much of a burden to run into one of these DC stations and get a charge and be on your way. And then there's the fourth one here I have is wireless. I don't know if anyone has a phone that you can put on a pad instead of plugging in. It's the same principle as that. It's an induction loop that would be on your vehicle, an induction loop that's in the ground, and there's no contact. The power going through the loop on the ground transmits that power to the vehicle. This standard, they came out with this standard and approved it in 2020. So now that should help this kind of charging sort of expand, and now that they've agreed on a standard. But the vehicles have to be shipped with this loop to really make this a good solution. And so far, it's kind of an aftermarket or an upgrade to a vehicle. So it's not ready for prime time yet, but as garage owners, kind of be thinking about this could be something that emerges. It's not it's not a snake oil salesman coming to you talking about wireless. What is this? It is actually a viable technology. It's just not ubiquitous yet. And it probably will take a bit to kind of dig in on that. But that doesn't mean don't install charging in your garages. Once you get the circuit there, it'll be very straightforward to kind of replace a plug with a wireless at some point if that becomes the standard. But today, it's in garages and in public spaces, workplaces, where we're looking at level 2 and DC fast charging. Those are the two primary charging technologies. All right, so where are we today with the EV market? I'll start with a trivia question here. I don't think this was answered in the last presentation, although it was a lot of history in there. But at the beginning of the 20th century, so early 1900s, can anyone guess what percentage of automobiles were powered by electricity? 2%? 100? Wow. I've never heard anyone guess 100 on this question. It's something in the middle. It's actually 38%. Around 1918-ish was the peak. And there's a picture of Thomas Edison and his son in a 1903 Baker electric car. Steam was actually the top propulsion method, electricity and then gasoline. And then by the 20s, we started to discover that we have a lot of oil under our country. So we were able to extract that very inexpensively, and the rest is sort of history there. So now we're seeing electric vehicles being talked about again after 100 years. And it is the time now for electric vehicles to emerge and be the new technology going forward. This is a snapshot of the global EV market. Kind of the important points here are in bold. We're at 11.3% of all vehicles sold in the world right now are electric, have some sort of plug. Some of those are hybrid. It's about 70% are pure battery electric, and about the other 30% are hybrid plug-ins, which mean they have a gas engine and a battery. And these are all kind of forecasted numbers, but we're late in the year. so they're probably going to be pretty accurate once the beans are all counted at the end of the year. 10.6 million EVs sold, which is a 57% increase in the volume of electric vehicles from 2021. And that will bring the total up to about 27 million electric vehicles globally. You can see the curve here, and we've got, does this thing work? Do we have a, oh, we got some dots. This very steep. It basically doubled from 2020 to 21, but that was a bit of a misleading kind of figure to look at just the last 2 years because it was flat before that through COVID. So COVID sort of suspended a lot of the growth. If you kind of look at the general trend, though, we're probably a good number to expect for the next few years will be a 50% increase each year. 50% increase of growth each year. But not all markets are the same. In Europe, they've got a 17% market share, so almost double probably about double what the worldwide percentage was in 2021. But they're slowing a little bit. They've got supply chain issues that are worse than ours. They have the Ukraine war as a distraction. They've got some other things going on there that have kind of slowed their fast growth. So they're this year expected to be 9% faster than last year, which is still growth and still great. But the shift is more towards Asia. China's gobbling up a lot of battery production and electric vehicles, and we're starting to get in the game. So China in 2021 was at 13%, had the lion's share of actual vehicles at 3.4 million sold in 2021. Other markets at the list at the bottom are starting to emerge pretty quickly. The first half of 2022, first half of this year, they doubled their number of vehicles sold from the first half of 2021. So they're really on a steep growth curve right now. But what about here? What are we doing in the US? And Canada's numbers are pretty similar to this. So you can see Canada from the Peace Bridge over there, just a few steps away. So we shouldn't ignore what's going on in that market. And they are moving pretty aggressively as well as the US and sort of mimicking our numbers. 2020 numbers, 2% of all vehicles sold in the US were electric, had a plug that equated to 350,000 vehicles. 2021, that doubled. And in 2022, the first half of this year, we were up to 5.6% of all vehicles sold were electric. So we're on a path. We're on a growth path. It's not going to double each year. Again, probably a good number to think about is the growth will go up by about 50% each year. The growth, not the total number. Supply chain issues here are improving compared to other places in the world, but still a major drag on the industry. And so that is kind of affecting a lot of the materials and things that are coming in, especially the battery materials which were coming in from Asian countries that had much longer COVID lockdown periods than we did. So I mentioned we were at 38% of EVs back in 1920s or so, and here we've come full circle. We're starting to look at growth increases again here 100 years later. What's different this time? Are we going to hit a wall again at 38%, and then some new technology comes out and eats into that? That's possible, but I think there are three main things that are very different about the climate today than the past. The first is the vehicles and the OEMs, the original equipment manufacturers, are investing billions of dollars with a B in production facilities dedicated to electric batteries, dedicated to electric vehicle production. They've got, every OEM today has several models available that are electric. They're either plug-in or plug-in hybrids or full battery electric. By mid-decade, that's only a couple years away, they'll be having dozens of models, each OEM, and some are forecasting about 25% of their vehicles sold will be electric. And then by the end of the decade, they're looking at 50%, and possibly by the middle of the next decade, all of their fleets will be electric that they're selling, so they won't even offer gas vehicles around 2035. GM has said that, Ford, I believe, has, and some others. That's one wheel of the stool. The other wheel of the stool, another leg of the stool, is regulations. We've never seen the scale of government investment in a technology like we are with electric mobility today. And it's not just the US with, I'll get into kind of some of that money, but European Union has aggressive incentives, aggressive reporting, aggressive goals. Building codes is being changed. States are being, like California, Massachusetts are kind of pushing the envelope and putting those targets even more stringent than the federal government. There's just a lot of momentum, and we'll get into kind of what's going on with the carrot. It's mostly carrot today, and not so much stick, but I think stick will be part of the equation, after we have enough infrastructure. And then the third leg of the stool is the technology. The technology is vastly different than it was 100 years ago, obviously, but even 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Batteries are greatly improved. They're 80% cheaper than they were even 10 years ago. They're lighter, they're denser, they have more power in them, they can drive a vehicle longer. Battery technologies are going to continue to increase. There's a lot of different chemistries in batteries now. They're using far fewer heavy metals, far fewer rare earth metals than they were even a couple of years ago. So they're coming up with chemistries that are really better for the environment, easier to make, cheaper to make, and that's really the primary technical initiative that's pushing this industry forward. We're going to see cost parity. An electric vehicle, again, once supply chain issues kind of work out post-COVID, I think we're going to see cost parity with internal combustion engines. Maybe 2025 is optimistic, but definitely before the end of the decade, EVs will just be simply cheaper or no more expensive than a gas vehicle, and it'll be sort of a no-brainer. So I tell most people that if their next vehicle isn't an electric vehicle, it'll be the one after that. And then other things kind of on the horizon. It was touched on in the earlier session, autonomous vehicles. I think that's a decade away before that really changes our lives or even becomes present in any large scale. But I do think there'll be a lot of commercial applications that are autonomous that are already kind of being developed. Robots moving around warehouses and doing local deliveries and that sort of thing. V2G is microgrids and having resiliency by having the vehicles power buildings during outages and things like that. So I said that the growth isn't equal globally. Different parts of the world are adopting EVs quicker than others. That's the same here in the US. California, at over 500,000 registrations. This data is middle of this year. They're eating up a lot of the supply. California they have greater incentives. The OEMs have mandates that they need to clean their fleet and work towards zero emission goals. So a lot of the vehicles right now are going to California, which sucks up the oxygen for the rest of the states. But what we are seeing though is no matter what state you're in, the growth rate that I showed earlier is pretty consistent. So it was doubled from 20 to 21. Looks like about a 50% increase from 2021 to 2022. Those growths, even if you're starting at a lower position, like Georgia's at 10th, it's not even at the bottom of the US, but Georgia's growing just as fast as California. It's just their starting point is lower. New York's at 5th right now, over 50,000 EV registrations. And New England as a whole has about the same number of vehicle registrations overall as New York State, and also about the same number of, if you add up the 6 New England states, would be pretty comparable to New York. So the whole Northeast is kind of on this track, this journey together. So how do you charge these vehicles? They're coming. We can see the numbers that they're coming. They're not in great numbers in your garages yet. But you're seeing more and more of them. I'm guessing it's not unusual to see a handful or even a dozen EVs in your garage, even if they're not charging, because you don't you maybe have the equipment to charge or maybe don't, you're probably seeing the vehicles on a daily basis. This graphic is from Drive, Ohio. It came from their plan for the National EV Infrastructure Act application, and this is a kind of a graphic I'm seeing pop up more and more, and I think it describes kind of nicely where the charging is going to take place. The biggest percentage of charging will take place at the home. Some estimate that's about 90%. Some say it's a little bit less than that, but certainly the majority is home charging. Second would be workplace. You're having your company put a plug out front and being able to charge at work. And then you get into the more sort of public places that you need to charge, whether you're commuting to a downtown area with a downtown lot or visiting a commercial business that's a distance away and you need to charge, or maybe doing a long journey on the highway. So that's these upper parts in gray and white on the pyramid. You'll be spending less time in those charging stations, but they're going to be just as important to complete your journey in some cases. And as you go up this pyramid, you're spending less time in these places, so you want to have faster charging. You see DC charging at the top, interstate fast charging, inner city fast charging. These are places where you are going to need a charge, but you won't need it every day at the fast DC charging pace, but you will need it occasionally. So what are we doing here in New York? Since this is a New York conference, this is a map showing the alternative fuel corridors. So these are the main corridors of transit in New York that have been established by the Department of Transportation as alternative fuel corridors, which means they need to support alternative fuel charging. It can be other types of charging, alternative fueling. It can be other types of fuels other than electricity, but most of the focus is on electricity today. So the $7.5 billion that was mentioned earlier for the federal government to fund EV charging on our highway corridors is being divided up across all 50 states, as well as Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. And that money the goal is to turn all of these corridors into what they're calling EV-ready corridors that you'll have charging at least every 50 miles, fast charging. You can go in, get a full charge, close to a full charge in 20 minutes while you take a bathroom break or get a cup of coffee, come back and be on your way. Right now, the only places in New York that satisfy that criteria of they have a bullet list of criteria. It's 4 plugs within 50 miles of the next station, certain plug types, et cetera. They have some requirements. It's these areas in purple that are satisfying that today. That $7.5 billion, the portion that will come to New York, will build out the rest of this black area. You can see where the stations, well, maybe you can't see because it's very small, but there are little blue dots there. Those are the stations that meet the criteria for the DOT today. So calling them NEVI compliant stations, because that's the name of the program. Where are the cars? Does that match up with the cars? This is total of non-Tesla registrations. Why non-Tesla? Because the government is not interested in putting money behind Tesla charging stations. Tesla's doing their own thing. They've got their own plug, their own technology to charge their vehicles. They're building their network out very well, but their network they chose to go in a different direction from the agreed upon standards. And so the government isn't putting in charging for Tesla. They're putting in charging for the agreed upon plug standards. So these are as you get from red to green and blues, yellows, those represent the areas with higher concentration of these vehicle registrations. No surprise, you get them around the cities and a vast open areas of dark red there with no EV registrations in those open areas in between the corridors. And then there's downstate, which has quite a few EVs today. Long Island in particular New York City, Westchester County, high concentration of vehicle registrations today. So it aligns pretty well with where the stations are, at least today on that earlier map, the purple areas. But to really connect and really open this technology up to everyone, the rest of that needs to be built out, which this money is being flowed over the next 4 years. The expectation is by the end of the decade, those maps, those corridors will be fully built out and NEVI compliant. That report also got into some of the amenities that are important to have at these stations. So if you're involved in, and this goes for level 2 stations, doesn't have to be the highway corridors, but what are people looking for? What is going to attract an EV driver to your facility, and choose yours over someone else's facility that offers that? The bars are very confusing here, the way they did this graph. They were, the survey was done on a ranking basis, but basically the more blue you have, the more gray. The more blue and orange, the first couple of bars, represents the higher importance. But the categories that were important, lighting was very high on the list, having safe lighting, having the perception of safety and feeling comfortable plugging in and hanging out there for a little bit while your car charges. Having touchless payment, that was certainly brought up in the first session today. That's ever more important. 24-hour restrooms, 24-hour food opportunities, nearby shopping, and Wi-Fi were all top reasons for folks to want to choose, or top requests for amenities at EV charging stations. So we've done some studies for our clients, and kind of the way we break it down is we look at the kind of the use case of electric vehicles or vehicles in general, and discuss with our clients who are the users that you want to address. So each of you, if you're representing different university or airport or municipality or a business, maybe you have a fleet being managed in your operation, you've got different types of users. We've got daily commuters who are just doing kind of maybe a 20, 30-mile commute in a day, sometimes need charging at their destination or workplace. Certainly that's appealing, can help you with hiring and other things. Residents, if you're in a residential area and you have residents that don't have dedicated parking, they're using street parking, it's not assigned parking, that's a challenge that municipalities need to work out. How can those residential neighborhoods be served by EV charging? Maybe it's on-street charging stations on the curb, maybe it's dedicated parking lots that have charging. The long-distance travelers, these are your out-of-state visitors, your long sort of distance drivers. And then commercial and municipal fleets, which really can vary quite a bit. There's a lot of subcategories in that. It could be transit buses that are on fixed routes. It could be long-haul trucking. Very different use cases, very different ways of solving the different fleet challenges. Why would you want to look at this? Why not just wait and let people figure out where to get their own charging? Well, the benefits are you're going to attract customers, residents, people who want to live in that area if it's a residential area. General commerce will presumably increase by having, we talked about 5% of the folks are driving EVs. Why would you want to turn off 5% of your potential client base? So attracting a portion of the customer base. Advertisements can be a revenue source. Pay per use, these stations can pay for themselves by swiping credit cards or having an app where revenue comes from charging. And then cleaner air quality. I actually did a case study with the city of Dallas recently, and they had some examples of kids who were staying home from asthma-related illnesses, up to like 30% of the student body in some districts, directly attributable to the air quality around the schools and in the environment these kids were living in, and the diesel buses and other types of air pollution. I was kind of floored by that number, 30%. Even if that's a little bit off, that's still way too much respiratory illness. And so cleaner air quality for many organizations, that's an important goal. All right, another trivia question. What's the top speed record for an electric vehicle? Who's got a guest venture here? Yeah?
Are you asking about vehicles that are available to the public or like?
No, just the speed record on a
180?
180's a guess. Any others? 500. Again, the answer is between the two. 353 miles per hour. Yeah, I don't know if you can buy that available to the public, but you'd have a really hard time fitting in one of the parking garages, I think. Yeah, I thought that was kind of interesting. That's pretty fast. And the difference is, like, the speed record for an internal combustion engine, I think, is around 500, or I think it broke the sound barrier. But that had a turbo, basically a jet engine on it to get to that speed. This is an electric vehicle that's being completely driven with the wheels and the friction of the tires. So that's pretty amazing speed record, really. And they're looking at 400 potentially next. But back to kind of reality. This is an example of a cab company in the Midwest who's really been interested in moving towards electrification, but they weren't really sure how to do it. So this is how they kind of solved their problem. They wanted to take a portion of their fleet, electrify it, kind of learn from it. So what they ended up doing is they got 20 Teslas. They were able to get, I think some of them were used and some of them were new. They used some grant and other incentives. And their typical model with their internal combustion engines, where the taxis come to the depot at the end of the day, they get detailed, filled up, oil change, whatever, and then they go back out to the suburbs to do their routes around the city. And what they found is that's a lot of wasted. They were going probably 30, 40 extra miles a day coming into the central depot and going back out in the morning or when they're used next in service. So they built 6 amenity stations. 3 of them are used in a public library, so they were providing a public service by having a charging station available for public residents in the area. Also kind of addresses a residential charging issue. And they had some 3 other stations they built up on their own. And they basically put these around the periphery of the city core. And they had their Tesla vehicles, so they put Tesla superchargers in. And they found that this really, the goal was to have these vehicles available 24/7 on-demand routes so that you can't get a call to pick up someone and not have enough charge. And they don't know what the routes are going to be ahead of time. So having these amenity centers around the periphery, the drivers are able to pull in. They have 15 minutes between their next call, or they need to take a rest or their break. And they'll be fully charged by the end of that 15 minutes. So that worked exceptionally well, having those peripheral amenity centers. It actually relieved some of the congestion and some of the burden from that central depot that they were using before in the model for the internal combustion engines. They have customers who are actually requesting the EVs, so they're getting higher level of service. They're getting some demand for this particular. They were able to measure the maintenance benefit, reduce maintenance costs, which I mentioned earlier, based on the way electric vehicles are designed. Another benefit was that because they're doing less maintenance on these vehicles, they had less downtime. So they're able to use the vehicles for longer. They're in service. Their service life is a higher percentage of the day. Overall, it reduced their operating costs to about half the cost per mile from their internal combustion engine taxis. So it was a pretty successful and innovative way of kind of solving some of the problems that electric vehicles have, some of the challenges, I should say challenges, not problems, a different way of thinking about how those vehicles need to be fueled. You don't just drive into the nearby gas station. They have to go to these amenity centers, but they put the amenity centers where the cars were instead of expecting the cars to move to some central location. All right, let me get into funding here. I know I'm getting kind of late here, so I'll go quickly, but I'm happy to go into more detail one-on-one if you get any questions afterwards. But these are the three big ones that you hear about now for funding from the federal government that have happened over the last year. Actually, Buy America was first. That was one of the first things Biden did in office, was to put a mandate and a goal to convert the federal fleet of vehicles. So the largest fleet in the world is the US federal government fleet, 650,000 vehicles, and a roadmap for getting those converted. Leverage US manufacturing power. It's called CHIP, an act to increase our ability to make some of these parts. They've got an all electricity on city buses and school buses, goals set up for that. So that was the first thing. The second thing that came along was NEVI, the National EV Infrastructure Act. That's the $7.5 billion to build out the corridors that came out. A goal of 500,000 stations by 2030. And a station, by this definition of this program, is multiple DC fast charging plugs, 4 or more charging plugs in a station. And then most recently, the Inflation Reduction Act renewed the tax credit on the vehicle purchases, $7,500, so that had expired or was actually getting used up very quickly. They've also added a used car, so now we're starting to see used vehicles. They've been around for a while. So there's a used tax credit. There's a heavy-duty incentive for work trucks up to $40,000. 30% credits for EV chargers. You can also incorporate battery storage and other types of grid technology into that and receive the credit. This is on the renewable electricity generation side, wind and solar type installations. They've renewed, finally, for an extended period, these two very important production tax credit, investment tax credit incentives, which really should stimulate a lot of renewable generation, large solar fields, large wind installations. And funding to electrify the U.S. Postal Service. Common themes with today's administration is social equity. 30% of every dollar needs to go to these disadvantaged communities, underserved communities. School buses, electrifying school buses, getting to zero emission for school buses, and then Buy America to bring a lot of the manufacturing back home. Quick snapshot of incentives, where they are on a state level. Almost every state has some incentive except for 5 in gray, either with the green represents both vehicle and charging station incentives, and yellow and blue is one or the other. Here in New York, we have a NYSERDA rebate for vehicle purchases up to $2,000, toll pass discounts, heavy-duty trucks are addressed, or rebates up to $185,000 available. Transit buses, grants. On the EV charging side, property tax credits, rebates, different programs through different parts of applications, whether it's heavy-duty charging or home charging or public charging. These can be found out on the NYSERDA website, and also a website called desireusa.org, DSIRE-USA.org. I just briefly want to mention the renewable fuel standard. This is something you probably have had no interaction with before in your past, but it's something that may start to come up. We're expecting an announcement by the US EPA in November, which will open up an electric vehicle incentive through an existing program that's been around for more than 10 years called the Renewable Fuel Standard. And what this will do will enable biogas production, like a landfill or wastewater plant, to electric vehicle. We're looking at possibly up to $1.5 billion of incentives flowing through here. So if you're, the bottom message here is, if you're working with any municipalities, if you are a municipality and you have assets like wastewater treatment and landfills, come talk to me. I can fill you in more on this program. I am at time, I think. What do I have? I'm at time? Okay, so I won't get into this case, but I did want to talk about NOPEC, a customer we worked with. Just the high level is they're a council of governments, 242 communities in Ohio, And we're working with them they want to be leaders in electrification in Ohio. Their territory comes right up to the edge here of New York. And they took actions of studying we provide studies for them on what's going on in their area, interviewed the stakeholders, surveyed their members, and we're working with them on rolling out some incentive programs for EV. This is a forecast we put together for them. We did surveys for them to identify where their communities were today. So most of their communities are not thinking about electrification, but they're starting to look at a 2 to 5 year horizon. More and more of them are starting to put it into their budget, so it's interesting to kind of see that being developed. So I will just kind of conclude here. I know I'm at time. If you're real estate owners and operators, what should you be doing today for your EV roadmap? One thing we can support you with, or do it on your own if you have the resources, is an infrastructure study. Identify what the user groups are. I mentioned those 4 user groups before, the different charging pyramid. Identify what goals you want to attain by putting in charging, who you want to serve, what functions you want to serve, and move that into establishing an EV infrastructure plan. You can't just build this overnight. This has to be something that's a 5 to 10 year plan and longer, and how you're going to maintain it. That was an important point brought up earlier. So having, if you have real estate assets, knowing what your plan is, putting a plan in place, we can help you with that, certainly. If you're a fleet owner or operator, a lot of the same things. A lot of fleets now and businesses need to measure their carbon impact, measure their environmental footprint, and that's a process called life cycle assessment and other ways of doing that measurement. What is the actual impact of your fleet? How do you reduce that in the best way that costs the least dollars to eventually convert your fleet to something that's zero emission or low emission? All these steps to get you there, and then monitor the progress and rinse and repeat until you get to those goals. So that's it. I'm a couple minutes over. I apologize, but there's my contact information. I think my cards, I didn't mean for them to go around, didn't mean to force my cards on everyone, but they are floating around here somewhere in a box if you would like my cards.
Before I officially thank you, I wanted to mention that there are a number of EV charger providers that are on our showroom floor. Please visit them. It's a good follow-up. And this afternoon, this was a perfect foundation for this afternoon's panel discussion, where we will have all sides of the equation. We'll have a utility, we'll have installers, we'll have parking operators, equipment providers. So it'll be a really good follow-up to this, and Dan will join that discussion as well. So thank you on behalf of NISPA.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
And,
appreciate
okay.
it. That's right. And we didn't get to questions, but please, come up and ask questions if you've got any.